and Peter Campbell, motor industry correspondent for the Financial Times. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24. Were you surprised when this news broke?
I think everyone who covers the global industry was absolutely shell-shocked by this. Carlos Ghosn, as you've been hearing, is an absolute giant of the industry. He saved Nissan, he saved Renault, he merged them together in this kind of not quite merged alliance, and he's grown them into what is the world's second largest car maker today. So for him to have a fall from grace like this, I think absolutely no one saw this coming. And I think that sense of shock was there when you saw Saikawa, the Nissan CEO's press conference earlier. The atmosphere in the room, I'm told, was actually electric. You really couldn't anticipate something like this happen.
Yeah, 2 years ago, it seemed as though Ghosn had weathered the storm here in France. There was huge outcry over the 7 million euros he was paid as boss of Renault. Of course, the 7 million didn't take into account what he earned at Nissan.
Ghosn's pay has always been an incredibly sensitive subject for him and for the companies. I mean, for years he was drawing CEO-sized salaries at two businesses. Japan, where they're very sensitive to high pay, and France, where they're equally sensitive to issues of what's seen as corporate largesse. And so this was always an issue with Renault shareholders and with Nissan, that no matter how well he was doing in both companies, the question of his pay was always one that would come back again and again. Now, obviously, his pay had gone down slightly when he stepped back from being the CEO of Nissan, but at the same time, he added another income stream from Mitsubishi, chairman of Mitsubishi. So this issue was always an incredibly sensitive issue for him, and always was what was one of the main points of argument and disagreement between him and the French state, which ultimately was one of Renault's biggest shareholders.
And it was, as you say, it's something in the French culture, CEOs who earn large sums. By the way, Carlos Tavares over at Peugeot, same thing. Eyebrows were raised there, Peter Campbell. So is it the French public that, just doesn't get the way capitalism runs, or are they right to be outraged?
I think if you look at instances where people have been running their businesses for a long time, and they've almost come to embody their companies. Think of someone like Martin Sorrell at WPP, who was based in London. For years, there were talks about whether he was paid far too much. He received tens and tens of millions from the company. And yet, because he built up the company, he'd grown it almost from scratch, and he was seen as integral to its success. That issue never really came to a head. He had shareholder revolts, but he was never forced to hand back any money. And I think that's the same with Carlos Ghosn, that people look at him and they look at the way that he held Nissan and Renault together when both car makers would have otherwise struggled independently. The way he built them into one of the biggest titans in the automotive world. I think that's why he was excused with getting away with getting quite so much money from these companies. That was clearly a hugely sensitive issue, and we still don't know the exact details of what it is he's alleged to have done. Mr. Saikawa did not elaborate on those in the press conference earlier. But it's clear that this was certainly a massively sensitive issue for Carlos Ghosn and for his company.
And for the future of the alliance, Kate Moody was mentioning earlier how when that alliance was struck back in 1999, Nissan was the sick patient. Renault came to the rescue. Now, I'm looking at these statements in the past hours by the French economy minister, Bruno Le Maire, and he's saying the future of Renault is not in danger. It's kind of like those backings the owner gives to a football manager before he's sacked. Is Renault in trouble?
Well, currently the whole of the car industry is undergoing a period of massive change. That's no surprise to anyone. All the car companies have to invest in electric technology, self-driving technology. They have to look at new business models at the same time as keeping a very fiercely competitive current business running. And at the same time, we're seeing car sales in Europe peak, car sales in the US are falling, car sales in China are falling. These are the engines of profitability for all of these companies. And Nissan and Renault have been able to lean on their global scale and pricing before. Scale in this industry is a huge factor in survivability. As you've already heard, they sold more than 10 million cars together last year. And that certainly has helped them in the past. Now, if Renault or Nissan want to go their separate ways and look at surviving themselves, they'll discover that life as a mid-sized car maker in a very large global industry is actually really a difficult place to be. And so the great strength of the alliance has been allowing both of those companies to lean on the weight of the combined mass and to be able to weather the storms. And it'll be far more difficult to do that if they go their own separate ways.
One final question on that point, Peter Campbell. I know over in Britain, eyes roll when we see statements by the French government, which also happens to be a shareholder, a crucial shareholder in Renault. In fact, I'll read you what Bruno Le Maire, the finance minister, said. He says, as referent shareholder for Renault, our first preoccupation is the stability of Renault and the consolidation of the alliance between Renault and Nissan. How are statements like that viewed on your side of the channel?
Well, I think the issue of French ownership of their car companies is not a new one. They obviously want what is best for those companies. They want to protect their industrial footprint. Britain is doing that at the moment as well with many of the car plants that are located here. But I think the big question of the alliance merger, could it possibly ever go for a full-blown merger? Could they ever change the capital structure with Renault and Nissan owning more shares in each other than they do? It was always seen, particularly in Japan, that French government's ownership of Renault was always a block to that. They would never want to have one company where the French government owned stakes in the overall merged entity. So there were always political barriers to a full merger going through. And if the French government is obviously concerned for the future of Renault and wants it to be stable, and no doubt Nissan shareholders are taking exactly the same view, but the question still lingers over the alliance of whether it can continue in its current form or whether something is going to have to change. Now, to his credit, Mr. Ghosn has been talking for months about trying to make the alliance irreversible, trying to pave the way from a time when he won't be around. We know there have been some discussions between the companies about how they might change their structure. We don't know where those discussions have got to. But one thing is certain, the alliance has sort of limboed along for the last almost 2 decades in its current structure. And the question is how long it'll be able to do that if Mr. Ghosn is no longer at the head.
Yeah, one person's departure can have consequences the world round. Peter Campbell of the Financial Times, many thanks for joining us from London.